Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Josh Hobbs is back in this episode for his second appearance. Just as with the first appearance, the subject is political. This time, we're discussing whether we should all be activists. More specifically, does the existence of global structural injustice give us a responsibility to respond to those injustices, and should that response take the form of activism? Josh thinks there are reasons to think not everyone could or should be an activist, and introduces some other ways in which people can contribute, including something he calls scaffolding activism. Welcome to the podcast, Josh.
Thank you, Jim.
And we're going to try and answer a question today, which is, should we all be activists? Well, that's a kind of slightly simple way of putting it. But actually, what you're particularly interested here, Josh, in is whether the existence of global structural injustices implies that we should all be activists in trying to address those injustices, right? So just to get us started, would you be able to give us a sense of what you mean by global structural injustices and what kinds of global structural injustice are you interested in?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Jim. So when we're talking about global structural injustices, we're talking about injustices that are both structural and global, obviously. And what I mean by that is they're structural in the sense that the thing that's unjust is the structure itself rather than sort of our individual actions. So it's not like we steal something, we've clearly done something wrong, you can blame a particular person. Instead, it's more the idea that we just sort of carry on with our lives day to day, doing things that are seemingly fine, but that the sort of end result when we all do that is that we create a structure that's unjust. So,
okay. In what ways might it be unjust?
So I guess it's going to be a system where there's sort of some people who are really losing out. So like, I mean, a classic example would be sweatshop labor, right? You know, like when people buy clothes from sort of retailers offering sort of low price clothes, they're not doing it because they like hate people in less affluent countries or something. They're quite legitimately trying to use the limited money they have to buy some clothes that they can afford. But the result of the system that they are participating in is that some people are working incredibly long hours for incredibly poor wages.
Okay, great. And in answering this question, you're engaging with other philosophers, right? So other people have written about these issues. Some people think that the existence of those structural injustices implies that we have a responsibility to try to address them, right? So why do some people think we have such a responsibility?
Well, I guess that's actually a pretty contested question in the literature. So the idea is that by participating in these structures, we're in some sense complicit in the injustices. Exactly how, I think people give different answers. So some people might say that we reinforce the structure through the actions, that we're somehow sort of causally responsible for the structure by participating in it. Or sort of just broader senses of complicity or failing to change those structures that we live in. I mean, I think the exact sort of reason why we're responsible is pretty contested, and to me it ultimately isn't super important. I think there's a range of plausible answers as to why the fact that we're implicated in these structural injustices means that we probably ought to do something about them.
Yeah, okay. So we can perhaps agree for the sake of argument that we do have some responsibility to do something about these structural injustices. But then the question that naturally follows from that is, well, what's something then? What do we have a responsibility to do? So what does that responsibility entail? What kinds of activities do people think we have a responsibility? If we have that kind of responsibility, we should be engaging in?
So the first thing to say here is that the thing that's unjust are the structures. So the way to address it is by changing the structures. Right. And so that looks like doing things like changing your sort of purchasing decisions in the case of sweatshop labor, say, might not change the structures on its own. Right. So it's not really about individual complicity. Right. Like somebody like Iris Marion Young, who's sort of one of the main names in this area, and seminal in this context. She wouldn't think that simply not buying clothes from sweatshops sort of yourself would necessarily be enough to free you of the responsibility to address it, because it's there's a broader structure there of sort of how clothes are produced, and even if as a consumer you could afford to buy clothes from sort of more ethical places, there's a sense in which sort of that's still part of the broader structure as a whole. So I guess what you need to do individually is to act to change the structure in some way. You can't do that individually, though. Obviously you have to do that collectively. So the way that the authors, sort of like Iris Marion Young, have tended to suggest that this sort of cashes out in practice is engaging in political activism together, trying to do things to sort of shape the structures, sort of contest the unjust elements of them, pressure people in power and things, such that the structures themselves change. So political change primarily realized through being an activist.
That's really interesting. One thing that strikes me about that is I interviewed David Edmonds on this podcast recently, and we were talking about his new book, which is about Peter Singer and the shallow pond thought experiment and the effective altruists and all that. It strikes me this is quite different from what they're saying, right? So the effective altruists are just saying you should do whatever kind of creates the greatest benefit in the world. And actually one of the critiques that's made of them is they don't have much to say about structural injustice and the way people in the West, for example, might be complicit in structures which are keeping people in the developing world, at a disadvantage. And this is this kind of taking the other approach, which is saying, no, what we should focus on is exactly that kind of structural concern?
Yeah, very much so. So I think effective altruism, from my perspective, has quite a lot wrong with it as an approach to addressing injustice in the world. So I don't think it's any coincidence that it's so popular in Silicon Valley, where some of the structures that might actually be some of the most problematic structures right now are sort of going on. People aren't really interested in changing the structures. Arguably, they're looking at solutions that might reinforce them. So, yes, I think a political approach is a very different approach to the sort of the approach that's taken, at least traditionally, by the effective altruists. I know some within the movement have sort of looked at trying to sort of take a political approach to effective altruism. But yeah, as a general rule, this is the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting. Good. Okay, so to move on then. So we're interested in what people's individual responsibilities are to take part in that kind of collective political activism. And the question is, should everybody be activists, right? Should everybody be actually directly taking part in political activism in the kind of way that you've described? But there's a question about how demanding that is, right? So why might that be demanding? What are some of the barriers that make political activism demanding?
Well, I think for a lot of people, one of the reasons, that they don't engage in activism, I imagine whoever's listening right now, maybe you do engage in activism a bit, but it's highly unlikely that you do loads of activism in your free time, I think. I don't know if you do, Jim.
Nope.
Yeah, so it looks like there's different ways of thinking about that. And one might be that we're just all bad and lazy, but there might be sort of more principled reasons. And I think, the first one here is that activism does look very demanding, particularly of time. So, if you have limited free time, what people might call discretionary time, outside of your work commitments, like caring responsibilities, it looks like you get maybe at least some of that you might want to devote to, hobbies, things that like make your life worth living and the like. For some people, of course, activism will be that thing, but for many of us, it won't. So time looks like a real constraint here. Then there's agent-specific reasons, often activism requires a certain skill set that you might not have. You might not find the idea of going to big public demonstrations, for example, particularly appealing for reasons of sort of personality or sort of mental health concerns, or there's a whole range of reasons why some of these things might be demanding. And I mean, it's not just attending protests, right? You might think, okay, we'll get involved online, but like there is like there are barriers there, to being involved in online debate, and not just the fact that like some of it can be like unpleasant and stressful, like certain levels of sort of confidence and literacy and sort of knowledge of what's actually going on politically look like they're required. And once you add all this stuff up, it actually looks like it's asking for quite a lot, both in terms of time and in terms of skills.
Yeah. It's maybe worth closing off one thing which occurs to me there. So there's a question about kind of online activism, to what extent it really is activism and how effective it is, right? But I guess even the people who say we should all be engaged in activism could take account of that kind of question, because what they want us to do is to be engaged in activism in an effective way, right? So it's not like they're saying everybody should be posting on X or Blue Sky or whatever it is. If they think that's not an effective way of bringing about change, then that's not going to be of interest to them either, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's almost sort of grist to my mill, in that it looks like the forms of activism that are probably more effective are actually the ones that look uniquely demanding.
Right. Okay. So the kinds of forms of activism that require you to kind of take part in person, is that right?
Yeah, right. I think so. I mean, if we're sort of questioning the effectiveness of sort of hashtag activism stuff, then it looks like the things where you actually have to show up in person, and there's a whole range of sort of demandingness concerns around that.
Yeah. Okay, great. One of the points that you make that I think is quite interesting is that there's a way in which sometimes the activism of some depends on the non-activism or the non-participation of others. So what do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is that there's a sense in which activism looks pretty demanding. That's why one reason we might think that the demand that we all become activists looks like it asks too much. But another way we might look at it is just from a feasibility perspective. We can't actually all engage in activism. And this is the idea that the activism of some, in some ways, depends on the non-participation of others. And one way that can be is, if you're going to a protest and somebody's watching your kids, there's a sense in which they're not at that protest. I mean, obviously, there could be some sort of a sense in which they might be going to other protests at other times, but there's just ultimately a sense in which there's always going to be somebody who's not there, because when you're sort of at a protest, you're being supported by others in countless ways. And I don't just mean in the case of sort of showing up at a protest, in engaging in any form of activism, there's sort of a whole chain of people supporting you in different ways.
Right.
So that's one way in which I think the activism of some might depend on the non-participation of others. Another way I think you might say this is that, well, like, if we were all sort of shouting all the time about all the different things that we cared about, it would be sort of like social media, where like nobody's cutting through. There's just sort of a general clamor, and the effectiveness looks like it is sort of curtailed to some extent by everybody talking at the same time. So you might think that something similar applies with activism, where if we were all out protesting, people might take protest a little less seriously. It's the fact that it's sort of a break from a rupture of everyday non-protest that makes protest an effective strategy.
That's really interesting, because that, I suppose, implies that you should think quite carefully about when to protest as well, right? Because you want to make sure that it is something that is going to have that power to cut through. So you don't want to be sort of protesting all the time, because, as you say, it becomes background noise. I mean, there is a way in which, politicians find protest fairly easy to ignore anyway. But I suppose if it's unusual and brings people out who aren't normally engaged in that kind of thing, then it perhaps gets a bit more notice.
Yeah, definitely. I think a background condition of protest can be pretty easy to ignore. I mean, I guess there are cases when sort of high levels of participation has been the way in which a protest was effective. So you might think something like Me Too sort of relied on the idea that it was very widespread. But that's a unique kind of protest. If you're thinking of like a regular protest, I think the idea that there's sort of a background condition of non-protest that allows it to stand out seems plausible, like to me at least.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay. And another point that you make is that there's such a thing as pluralism, and that actually if we want to have respect for pluralism, that counts against the idea that everybody should be an activist. So that's something that we're going to need to unpack. So what do you mean by pluralism, and why do you think it's an attractive theory that we should take seriously?
So I suppose just before I jump into that, it's worth clarifying that pluralism doesn't mean that everyone shouldn't be an activist occasionally, but it does suggest that it's too much to ask for everyone to be committed to like an activist way of life where they regularly engage in protest. And that does look like the sort of thing that somebody like Iris Marion-Young is suggesting is the solution or the way we ought to act to address global structural injustices.
Right, okay. But what do you mean by pluralism? What is pluralism?
So by pluralism would essentially mean the idea that, or at least I mean the idea that there are a range of worthwhile and legitimate sort of ways of living, and that sort of liberal societies and sort of liberal political theory and discourse needs to sort of respect that. So, you know, somebody might choose to pursue like a life that sort of prioritizes art. Somebody else might choose to pursue a life that sort of prioritizes like religious worship or pleasure or something, and that ultimately these are just irreconcilable sort of lives pursuing different legitimate values. And there's not a right answer that says everyone must live in this way. There's sort of a range of reasonable answers.
Okay, so if that's what pluralism is, why does respect for pluralism suggest that we shouldn't all be an activist, at least in the direct way that people who've recommended this have in mind?
Well, I suppose that an activist life for many people is a very worthwhile one, but for, you know, it is one conception of a worthwhile life amongst many, which means that if we want to take pluralism seriously, we need to sort of think about how, other people might want to live differently, and they might have a legitimate claim on their, at least some of their discretionary time in order to do that. So this doesn't rule out sort of occasionally attending a protest or something, but it does rule out a life that's sort of primarily oriented around activism or that involves a significant amount of activism.
Yes. Okay, good. That makes sense. Okay, so there's a suggestion that pluralism means that there are kind of different things that people might value about their own lives, or kinds of activities that people might find valuable to do, right? So the thought is that if you're the kind of person who, for example, is drawn towards, you know, artistic creativity or something like that, then you shouldn't be kind of required to jettison that or sacrifice that completely in favour of something like this very, very demanding requirement of being an activist.
Yeah, or even just a quite demanding version. I mean, I suppose one thing you might be sort of thinking in the back of your mind is, you know, like, well, maybe you could do art, but art that helps address structural injustice.
Yes.
But I think it's that quite quickly starts to look quite problematic, right? I mean, it certainly makes me think of like, you know, sort of like social realism under Stalin or something, where like the art itself didn't have value. It was only valuable when it was sort of pushed towards sort of an end that was deemed valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's a sense in which, I don't know, if you're going to be an artist, you should be able to follow your own lights as an artist, right? You should be able to follow what kind of inspires you or makes you want to create art, and you shouldn't be kind of required to fit it into a certain mold. But we're not necessarily just talking about artists, right? I mean, it could be that somebody's, you know, what somebody finds valuable is family life, right? And you shouldn't be required to sacrifice that either.
Yeah, I think there's a range of reasonable conceptions of the good that individuals can pursue. Activism is perhaps an important one, but it's not the only one.
Okay, good. That makes sense. Right. And there's also something you highlight about division of labour. So why should we think about division of labour in this context?
Well, the division of labour thought here is just that, well, that as a collective, whatever collective that might be, there might be a range of collectively valuable projects that people can pursue. And it's sort of similar to the pluralist point, but at a collective level, you know, where like, if you're an activist, there's other things you care about. You might care about art, right? You might care about sort of like sensual pleasures, like restaurants and nice wine bars or whatever, you know, like you want to live in a society where there's a range of these sort of different sort of worthwhile things available. And that requires some people sort of pursuing things other than sort of the activist life. I mean, I think the important thought here is that, like, this isn't a situation where all the burdens are shifted on those who choose to pursue an activist life and everybody else is just having a nice time and getting away with it. They're also sort of doing collectively valuable things that even the activists are going to value, right? So burdens are shifted in both directions.
Yes. So even the activists will want to listen to some good music, for example. So somebody needs to be making the music, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And like the division of labor there is sort of, it's not about each of us compartmentalizing our lives into sort of, that's the activism bit, that's the music making bit, that's the sort of, I don't know, like cooking fancy meals bit. It's because that's just not going to be plausible with some of these goods. They look like they're things that sort of require a more sustained commitment to them. You know, so the division of labor can't happen at the level of the individual. It has to happen, you know, at sort of a higher, sort of more society-wide level where some people prioritize activism and other sort of citizens prioritize other things.
Okay, good. All right. So if not all ordinary citizens have a responsibility to be fully fledged activists, then does that mean they don't have a responsibility to address global structure injustice, or do they still have some responsibility?
Well, I think what I would want to say is yes. I'd want to say that those responsibilities don't just go away because of concern for pluralism, but there might be reasons why we might sort of think about tempering the extent to which realizing those responsibilities sort of shapes the structure of our lives.
Okay. So what then should people do? Is it just a matter of saying people should do something? Perhaps people should do more than they currently do, but they just don't have a responsibility to be spending huge amounts of their time being activists.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a range of different answers here. One you might give is to say that people should just do a little bit of activism. And I don't think that that's an implausible response for people who aren't committed activists. Their lives might be organized around other things and they engage in a little bit of activism. I think there's ways in which that's a completely plausible response, although I also think that perhaps there are reasons to resist it as well.
Okay. So what are the reasons to resist it?
Well, I think one might be that you still need sort of the skills and the knowledge and the like to engage in a little bit of activism rather than a lot. Yeah. So if you think of it as like a cost that you sort of pay to play, you still have to pay it whether you're doing a little or a lot. So there might be ways in which sort of smaller commitments to activism are actually more demanding than they first appear. I mean, again, like the pluralist concerns we might think still apply here, where, you know, sort of some things that look like they're very worthwhile, like lives committed to art and things, look like cases where the sort of single-minded commitment and focus to them is sort of part of the life, right? And then suddenly the sort of small bit of activism there maybe looks less sort of psychologically plausible than it does in the abstract. Yes. But my argument is not to say that, you know, doing a little bit of activism is silly, and it's just to say that there might be alternatives or different ways in which people can realize this responsibility.
Okay. I guess the division of labour point comes in there as well, again, doesn't it? Because you might think there's an advantage to having people who specialise at these kinds of activities. If everybody's doing a little bit, there's quite a high likelihood that those little bits aren't going to be very effective. Whereas if you've got certain people who are doing a lot, then they develop skills and they, you know, can really think about the approaches they're taking and make them more effective and things like that.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Okay. What's the role ideal model then? This is something else that you talk about in the paper you've written on this. The role ideal model. Why do you think it's a good model, or do you think it's a good model for what people should be doing?
So the role ideal model is a sort of answer around how or what ordinary citizens ought to do to address structural injustices that comes from Robin Zheng, and sort of it's quite different from Iris Marion Young's model. So what she says essentially is, rather than engaging in political activism, what we should do is sort of push the boundaries of our existing social roles in a way that acts to address structural injustices and global structural injustices. Right. So like maybe you're like a teacher, you think like, how within sort of my role as a teacher can I prioritize addressing structural injustice? Maybe like as a father, you might do the same thing. And in each of these roles, you sort of push the boundaries of your role in a way that addresses structural injustice. So you're not taking on new responsibilities. You're just sort of doing the same ones that you already have, but in different ways.
Okay. For example, at work, you might think about how you can kind of work towards diversifying recruitment or something like that, right? So, I suppose there's all sorts of ways that it might happen, but within your role, you find ways of trying to address those injustice. And as a parent, making sure that you bring up your children in such a way that they understand injustice and can kind of try to work against it themselves, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there are sort of some injustices where this might be a plausible model, but I think that I'm not convinced that it's the most appropriate or effective way for us to act to address global structural injustices of the kind that I'm interested in, like sweatshop labor, sort of climate change, or sort of global poverty.
Right. Why is that?
Well, so I think first off, there's a concern that this is incredibly demanding, even though on the face of it, it appears not to be. So it's incredibly demanding in the sense that it's sort of asking us to prioritize addressing global structural injustice in every area of our life. And I mean, that looks like it sort of is uniquely incompatible with respect for sort of other values or ways of living, right? You know, if first and foremost in your role as a father, you sort of foreground addressing global structural injustice, or your role as a teacher, it looks like, are you not sort of losing out on other incredibly valuable things here at the expense of sort of prioritizing one thing? So there's a sense in which, even though it's do this one thing in the areas where you're already doing things, it is doing it everywhere at the expense of other valuable projects, potentially. Yes, I see. But I mean, my main concern with it is not really that. I think my main concern is that, well, I agree with people like Iris Marion Young that the solution here is a political solution. The structures need to change. The way you go about that, I think, ultimately is through political movement. So we definitely need activists. My sort of claim is that not everyone needs to or should be an activist. So on Young's model, I just don't think you have the sort of realistic story about achieving political change that you get from Young. You know, I mean, some people sort of have called it kind of like a very individualistic sort of virtue ethics kind of approach to a problem that's ultimately a political one.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. All right. So we've explored a few different ways that somebody might try to work against global structural injustices. And one of them is by being an activist. And we've already kind of noted a few other ways. So it might be that there's a role, I suppose, for some of the kind of things that the role ideal model entails, right? It's just that that's not going to be the answer. It might help.
And particularly about global structural injustice.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And in your paper, you introduce another idea which you think can be one contribution to attempts to combat structural injustices, and you call it scaffolding activism. So, yeah, could you just say what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So what I mean by this is the thought that when I was talking about demandingness earlier, I mentioned the way that acts of activism are kind of the tip of a spear, right? They're sort of the visible part of like countless other activities going on that are making that person showing up at a protest something that's feasible. Right. So the sort of the support that makes activism possible is scaffolding. And there's kind of a negative side to that in terms of pointing out the ways in which activism is necessarily scaffolded and it's sort of a precondition of it existing. And then there's sort of a positive side of that where you sort of look at that as something that people can actively choose to engage in to make the activism of others more effective, more feasible, that kind of thing. And that's what I mean by scaffolding.
Okay. So in what ways might scaffolding activities be a good way for non-activist citizens to discharge their responsibilities?
Well, I suppose maybe first it's helpful to think of like some examples. So I think one example here, which I think is quite interesting, is like during the civil rights movement in America, it was often the case that there were sort of people who didn't engage in the civil rights movement directly, but supported people who were by providing like food, shelter, places to stay, these kind of things. And sort of the literature that exists now on sort of political activism and addressing structural injustices or injustices in general, I think sort of overlooks those kind of contributions. Right. I mean, more contemporary example could be sort of the university sort of, you know, you had these kind of what do you call them? Like sit-ins, that's it, against like protesting sort of the war in Gaza. And ultimately, like there were people who were there doing that thing, but you might also think that they were helped in countless ways by people who might have brought them like food, sort of hot drinks, you know, scaffolded them, made the fact that they were there possible.
Yeah. Okay, good. So, yeah. So that is a way that people might discharge their own responsibilities, right? So they might contribute to an overall program of activism, not by being activists themselves, or not directly by being activists themselves, but by essentially supporting people who are being activists in various ways. Good. Okay. Do you think people always have a means of doing that? I mean, what if somebody doesn't have an obvious means of scaffolding the activism of others, or at least not in an undemanding way?
Well, I think occasionally it might be the case that people don't have obvious ways to engage in protest or in activism without it being extremely demanding. But I think that scaffolding is something that can take place at a distance. So, you know, you might be able to support the activism of others through sponsoring activists or sort of buying or making supplies for protesters. So there's been sort of lots of examples of this, you know, where like there's sort of places you can go online if you're interested in doing that sort of thing, or like lots of cases of people sort of knitting supplies for protesters to use or to engage in protest with these sort of things. You know, I mean, you could be making a banner from afar or something. There might be a range of ways you could go about it that's sort of less obvious.
Yeah, okay. We're probably running out of time, but just one other thought then, and this is something that you address in the paper. So somebody might hear what you're recommending there and think, well, it still leaves quite a lot of power in the hands of the activists, right? So people are contributing to the activism of others, they're scaffolding, supporting the activism of others, and that's how they're discharging their responsibility. But you're then kind of beholden to what those activists then decide to do, right? All you're doing is helping other people. They get to decide how the activism is prosecuted. And you might, I suppose, have better ideas about how to go about it. So is there a problem there with the kind of power imbalance between people who are actually directly doing the activism and people who are just supporting it?
I think there's definitely always going to be a concern in these sort of circumstances with what sort of the philosopher and political theorist Kevin Elliott has called an aristocracy of activists, so where the people who are the activists are the ones sort of shaping the decision making and sort of leading things. There is a genuine concern there where sort of people with time and interest dominate stuff. I mean, you see this supposedly in all sorts of like voluntary sort of scenarios where you have kind of well-meaning middle-class people with lots of time on their hands who sort of shape policies and the like.
Yeah.
But I mean, I suppose ultimately the way I sort of end up thinking about this is with the analogy of sort of the division of labor that exists in sort of democratic politics already, where you can choose the politicians or the parties that you vote for, and they will sort of deal with the sort of specific policy issues. Yeah. You might see scaffolding in a similar light, where sort of the citizens who choose to scaffold activism are sort of choosing to scaffold certain groups who sort of represent the politicians in this, and then they sort of, those groups address the concerns or protest in the way that they sort of deem most likely to be sort of successful.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. Does that analogy make sense?
Yes, I think that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So let me just say, Josh Hobbs, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.